Okay, so hello everyone. We are about to start. There are seats in the first row. Looks really empty from here, so if anyone is courageous enough. People coming in, you can come to the front row. Privilege of late arrival. Okay, so my name is Simone Ruiz. I work for Allianz Climate Solutions, the competence center on climate change of Allianz Group, an insurance company. And I'm also member of the board of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. So it's my pleasure and privilege to be chairing this distinguished panel today. We will talk about insurance and comprehensive climate risk management, addressing the needs of the poor and vulnerable. Before I introduce the panel, I would just like to say that it's quite amazing what number of events MCII and other institutions have put up these 2 weeks on this topic. It's an emerging topic as we see the impacts of climate change over the past years on the rise. The heat waves, the fires, but also the amount of hurricanes we have seen this year. Not all are always attributable directly to climate change, but we can be sure and certain that in the future we will see more such events simply because the planet is warming, the sea levels are warming, the oceans are warming and the sea levels are rising. So I would like to introduce the panel today. First on my left, Joanna Haigh. Joanna Haigh is with the Imperial College in London. Then we have Christian Barthelt from the Munich Re Foundation. He will speak about public partnerships, public-private partnerships. And then we have Admasu Faisa from the Ministry of Finance of Ethiopia. So to the right, I continue with Soenke Kreft, who's heading the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. So we will have different perspectives today on the topic, and I think without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Joanna, who will speak about the topic I just mentioned, the impacts of climate change, and set the floor for the further discussion as to what we need to do to address these impacts. Thank you, Jo.
Press the green button, they said. I'm pressing the green button and nothing's happening.
Sorry, Joanna, I think you have a trouble presenting from there because you can't see the slides. You might want to just stay sit. It's easier because you can see your slides unless you know them by heart, but that would be really, really good. Okay, then we need to use the mouse. Some technical... Now, here you go, please.
I'm not an expert on finance in any sense at all. I don't know much about money, but I'm a climate scientist, and I think I'm here to sort of set the scene in terms of how climate is changing, the impacts, and particularly extreme events, which will have the biggest impact on the insurance industry. So if you want to think about how climate extremes might change, you can look at a distribution of something like in this top panel on the right there. There's a normal distribution with a sort of average in the middle. In this case, it's temperature, but it could be anything like precipitation or any other climate parameter. And then you have a spread. Some years are warmer, some years are colder, and you know that some years are very warm and some years are very cold. But when we have global warming, the whole pattern shifts. And so the distribution moves, in this case, it's moving to the right. And you can see that the average is getting warmer, rather obviously. But then if you look at particularly at a particular temperature down there, you see that it's going to be more frequent if we're on the warm side than it was before. And in particular, if you look at the new average, it's about twice as frequently as the previous one. And then you get to that hot, and it's about 3 or 4 times more frequent than the previously. And then you get to the more, where it says more record hot weather, those sort of temperatures hardly occurred ever before. So you can see this is why the extreme events are going to happen and why they're so important. And what we want to know is how climate change affects the occurrence or the severity of extreme weather events. And I've shown a simple example of temperature, but of course we want to know the precipitation, the floods, the fires, and all the others. And then if we put the question round the other way, if we have a particular extreme event, can we attribute that to human-induced climate change, or is it just another natural factor? On the bottom right down there is an example of some work by the National Academies in which they're looking at the heavy rain events last year in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's a panel there that's showing that if you look at the top bars, it's 1900, and the bottom half par is today. And you can say that the average number of years between extreme events, heavy rain events, has gone from 50 years down to 30 years. And then on the right there, we've got a typical 3-day heavy rainfall total. It's gone up from 23 to 25 inches. That's just an example. I've got, I hope, another example. Thank you. Russian heat waves there on the left now, and you can see, I won't go through this in detail because of shortness of time, but what it's showing is that if you look at the July 2010 event, you can see probability is going downwards, and the return time is going downwards. So for that July 2010, which used to have a 99-year repeat time, is now down to about 30 years repeat time. So not all extreme events are the same. If you can see the panel on the right there, what we've got is, along the bottom, do we sort of understand from a physics perspective or actual fundamental perspective how different factors might be influenced by climate change? And on the vertical axis, we've got how well do we know how to attribute particular extreme events? And you'll see it's different depending on what sort of event you're talking about. So top right there is extreme heat and extreme cold. So we sort of understand pretty much how that's going to happen, and we're pretty good at attributing those extreme events. If you go down to the green one near the bottom, however, that's tropical storms, tropical cyclones, like in the Gulf of Mexico. We sort of understand the physics fairly well. As the sea surface gets warmer, you get more water vapor in the atmosphere. That gives the energy to the storms, and you get more intense storms. So we understand that physics fairly well, but we're not at all good at attributing individual events to climate change. So that's a different example. I'm not going to go through this list at all, but it's all in the bulletin of the American Meteorological Society this year, and they've looked at various events in 2015, and there's some things that they're pretty sure that can be attributed to climate change. So several extreme heat events up there across the world. Other examples like wildfires in Alaska and extreme rainfall in southeast China. But they also identified several signals that they couldn't find climate change could be used as a cause for them. So it was cold in Canada and the US, and late onset of Nigeria's rainy season. It wasn't possible to attribute that to climate change. So we have to be very careful when we see extreme events not to always say that it's due to climate change or human-induced climate change. So just this is a summary really, and it's results from an Avoid project, which is looking at what happens if we don't avoid climate change, and if the current carbon emissions carry on like they're going at the moment. By 2100 we've got these impacts here, and I'm not going to read them all out. You can see a lot of people are being very badly affected by the human-induced climate change. So I think I'm out of time.
Actually, you're right on time. Thank you so much, Jo. I think this was very highly interesting. I just wonder, when you do this research of climate change attribution, really attributing specific events to climate change, what is the motivator? Why do you do that? If you could give me a quick hint. Yeah, I think this is an interesting question.
It's hugely important. If you want to know, are more people going to starve or be flooded or die, or all these horrible things going to happen in the future? What more important thing could there be?
I find it interesting, and I asked the question because I think it's obviously you want to understand the future better, clearly, and from an insurance perspective, we have seen that just between the 80s and 2016 last year, we have seen a tripling of costs from natural catastrophes, which has two components always: the socio-economic development. Obviously, we build more expensive houses, we have more expensive cars, the entire infrastructure at stake, we have more people living in cities, so there's a value concentration, but there's also this factor of more intense extreme events and more frequent extreme events. But this week we had a special in the Economist about, and I was curious what the Economist would write during the COP as an opener for the COP, and it was all about liability.
Yes.
And the attribution of specific events to climate change plays, of course, a role also in the legal discussions that ensue this. So I thought maybe you have other motivators than just trying to better understand the future, but maybe also trying to give a foundation for be it maybe an insurance company, but maybe also the civil lawsuit that some people are
well, of course, as climate scientists, we wouldn't be interested in the civil law, but we want to provide a sound scientific basis on which you can make your judgments. And as you rightly point out, a lot of the impacts are I mean, if you have an extreme weather event in some parts of the world, it won't be the same in another part of the world. And if it's in, say, in Bangladesh and you get heavy flooding, it's going to affect a large number of people. So you have to take the location into account as well as the actual impact.
Thank you very much. And in fact, we had questions as an insurer as to the hurricane season and how much we can attribute of these hurricane seasons to climate change. And it has been an unusual hurricane season. We had four hurricanes hitting the United States, and a value 8% of GDP being concentrated in this region of the US. So clearly a value exposure. But it was very hard for our experts to pin this down entirely to climate change. But as I said, we can expect more such events in the future. So I think, Soenke, you will be bringing in the insurance perspective. So I hand over to you.
Thank you, Simone. And also thank you, Joe. I first have to master the technology. It looks like if you're supposed to do a call with this one, no? Okay. So, I mean, when you come to these kind of side events, official side events, the business is such that you do mergers with other organizations. So when we actually thought about our side event, we looked at what are the different kind of organizations that also pitched different ideas. And then we saw this contribution on attribution, and I thought, that's actually perfect context to what we want to say around climate risk insurance and around targeting the most vulnerable people. And let me start by showing you a very old picture. It's actually 10 years ago, and it was presented to COP14 back then in Poznan by the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative as one potential response to what we just heard in the previous presentation, namely that the climate risk gap is widening, that is especially developing countries that are affected, and that we can increasingly also attribute a human fingerprint in that. And basically what we said back then was to make climate risk insurance tangible, that there should be a risk-layered approach as what we thought a guiding principle, that there would be like an international climate insurance pool or regional climate risk facilities that would like take care of this very extreme losses. Often also societies as well as individuals don't really judge well on these very rare events. It's not in your memories, so hence you undervaluated in your risk management, and this is also a reason for example, on the case of a country to an international community to move in. The second tier we thought about supporting for this medium layer of risks to cover people through, for example, microinsurance solutions, and to think about also to upscale these solutions through some sort of international climate finance. And of course, the bedrock of all of this would be prevention and adaptation, which is in cost effectiveness terms also something that is to be prioritized if you look at very frequent events. So that back then was our proposal, and of course attribution is part of that, and so we back then also proposed the international community and the industrialized countries to shoulder parts of the costs and to co-finance parts of these facilities. When I now look back, it's my 10th COP, I just counted, and then I realized actually it's not exactly the model we are having right now, but we have different elements and different political agreements that are covering part of that. So we have, for example, the G7 commitment of insure resilience to cover 400 million additional people until 2020, which I think at the level of heads of government has been the most impactful contribution so far. We also have it covered in the Paris Agreement, which I think is the watershed moment for the international climate regime, and the issue of loss and damage is in there in the specific article, but we even have institutions taking care of risk transfer, or specifically dedicated to risk transfer, namely the clearinghouse. We have a G20 acknowledgement this year, so for the first time the G20, usually very hesitant to address climate issues, had a specific decision on climate resilience, and they also focused on disaster risk finance and insurance solution. And we will see more at this COP. And then I think most importantly at the regional level, you had some of these countries coming together on a political level. For example, in Africa, the African Union launching these kind of regional climate risk facility. In the case of Africa, it's called the Africa Risk Capacity. So I see, if I look back, we had some progress there. Of course, we are not still where we need to be. We don't have created a basic safety net for all vulnerable people, but there are like a few stepping stones on which we can step into the future. Also, in terms of the technology again. Sorry, it works there. In terms of the actual countries looking at these kind of approaches, I think also we saw a paradigm shift. This is something we actually launched today, looking at all the different NDCs and looking on what's the role of climate risk insurance within the NDCs. So for those that are not familiar with UNFCCC jargon, it's like the climate action plans of countries as a part of the Paris Agreement. And what you see is that 38 countries actually have it in there. If you also account for the national adaptation plans, it's 42 countries, and they cover 4 billion people and half of the world extreme poor. So you really see that there is a demand and there is a need also raised by the countries as part of the Paris Agreement. And I think it's also remarkable because if you actually look into the details of the NDCs, you will find that many countries are actually not covering adaptation. So it's not the whole world we are looking at, only a subset of it. I now want to give you two specific examples. Technology, yes. Around how to further, what kind of approaches you can offer to close the protection gap that partially is also driven by climate change. And one of us is actually an activity that we are currently doing in the Caribbean. And maybe that's also something to say. I think this challenge is too big for any given stakeholder. I think the private sector cannot do it. They need the government. I think the government cannot do it. They need the private sector. I think both of them cannot do it because there needs to be a social consensus of moving forward, which means also the civil society and other actors need to come into the game. This was a realization we had in the Caribbean, where with one of these regional risk facilities, in this case the Kreft, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, we are spearheading for this micro and meso level a new kind of products that help, that are available to low-income groups and also suit low-income groups. So how does it work? In St. Lucia and Jamaica, and with a view to upscale to 5 other islands, we are looking at the hazard of extreme rainfall and extreme wind speed as a result of hurricanes. We use satellite data to verify the event, and then the clients will be notified through a mobile phone system, and a payout will be made within 14 days. And we had already a few payouts, so the system is working. We are now working through the challenges of upscaling, which means also looking at the trigger, kind of harmonizing with the need of the beneficiary groups, etc., etc. But it's just one of the approaches you can think about when closing the protection gap. And my last slide. In my first slide, I was explaining a system which is based on risk layer and looking at a frequency of events in order to judge what's the best option. Of course, there are more sophisticated ways, and I really think that in order to make it work, there needs to be a strategic bedrock to actually say when to use, for example, climate risk insurance, when to use prevention, and other forms. This is something we are doing in collaboration with the GIZ, the German Development Cooperation Organization. I'm never using the right term for that, like GIZ. And what we try to do is actually on a country level, think about how these strategies could work, and also for specific sectors. One example is Morocco. So you see the conceptual framework, which is around disaster risk management cycle, but including also to purposefully manage the kind of residual risks that you cannot adapt to, and then apply that to a certain sector. And in this case, it's in a special economic zone near Agadir in Morocco. And I think it's very interesting because small and medium business often employ people. It's often kind of precarious employment, and if there's like a calamity, these people lose their job, and it has a huge impact on their livelihood. So for us, it's an interesting entry point to target most vulnerable people. And what we do is now through a kind of we use an instrument called ECA, Economics of Climate Change Adaptation, which thinks about a profile on different adaptation options and when to move in with a climate risk insurance instrument. And we hope that this kind of strategies then also will be the point where then an insurer can take up and actively market a niche for an insurance product. So these are two concrete examples, but generally what we also think is there needs to be kind of an overarching framework, and this is something that we expect to see here at COP23, and it will be high on the agenda. For instance, I think having a Pacific Island COP allows to look more on the consequences of climate change. We see decisions to be taken in the context of loss and damage, 5-year work program, but we will also see some of these international initiatives, I think, doing new announcements, and I think this is, should be some of the deliverables here in Bonn. Thank you.
Thank you, Soenke. I think you made a very good point, that is we need to keep the momentum up. It's difficult enough to bring the different parties, the different stakeholders to the table that you just mentioned, the civil society, but also the governments and then the insurance industry. And so I think you made a lot of really useful framing points. I just wonder, if I may ask the audience, who of you knows or has heard the concept of climate risk insurance before this event? So more than 50%. Who would be able to explain it to a friend? Who wants to give it a try? Oh, I see no hands. Come on, someone courageous. Quick, just there's microphones here and there. I would just like, because if we have a shared understanding, it makes it a lot easier to communicate about this topic. If someone is courageous enough to just say, there's no stupid answer really, because everyone would give another answer, honestly. There's no one single definition of what climate risk insurance is. So I would be really curious to hear. Would someone be volunteering? Otherwise, I give it a go. Okay, so climate risk insurance, and I think this is often used as a very broad basket concept for meaning insuring anything against odd weather events. So it could be a hailstorm, it could be a hurricane, it could be a drought, it could be a flood. And it's not always necessarily a climate related. I mean, it's always a meteorological event, but it's not always related to climate change necessarily, because this distinction, as we just heard from Joe, is just not yet crystal clear, not yet possible. Very often it's addressed to developing countries, although of course you could classify standard developed country natural catastrophe insurance the same way, but it's often relating to index-based insurance, and the index-based insurance means you have a specific meteorological trigger in place, say windstorm above a certain level, and when this trigger is hit, you get a payout, and you get it instantly, no matter if there has been a damage or if there has not been a damage. And that problem that you might have a damage but not a payout from the insurance is called basis risk. The same way goes the other direction. You might have no damage but a payout. We had these occasions as well. And there are very, very few climate risk insurance schemes in the world that insure governments, and many more on a micro meso level. And I'm very pleased to have Christian on the panel today from my Munich Re Foundation, because he will speak about the topic of more the meso level, but make the point, I think, that you really need the stakeholders at the table from all sides, and you need to make it sustainable. So thank you, Christian.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. I would need the pointer, please. Yes, so my name is Christian Barthelt. I work for the Munich Re Foundation, which is a non-profit organization founded by Munich Re some 12 years ago. Munich Re, again, is a big reinsurance company. When we started our work, we got the task to work in two pillars, more or less. One is disaster risk management, for example, flood warning systems, early warning systems, capacity building for women self-help groups in slum areas, and so on. And the other pillar was the sector of inclusive insurance or microinsurance. In the beginning, those two pillars were more or less strictly separated, but within the last years, we saw that they more and more grow together. And I think it's important because microinsurance or inclusive insurance is one very powerful tool in the disaster risk management toolbox, so to say. To be honest, I come very much from the first pillar, so the disaster risk management, like flood warning systems. I'm not an insurance expert, but still I try to give my best here to give rather a meso perspective. We just saw that almost all have heard about climate risk insurance, but almost none of you could really explain what it is. And this, I think, is a problem in the whole fashion right now, that people often talk about insurance but are not fully aware what it is. And insurance, I think, is much more than just a pay-in, pay-out scheme. So if you would ask a regular people on the street in Bonn, for example, he would say, okay, I pay a premium for something, and if I encounter into a loss or a damage, I will get some compensation. But insurance can do much more, and I would just to point out a few points here. So for example, insurance can enable activities. Maybe not a but just think of driving in Germany. Driving wouldn't be possible if you wouldn't have an insurance scheme or insurance provider who steps in when you have an accident, for example. To put it in the world of climate risk insurance, insurance also can make investments possible. For example, if you think of a huge infrastructure project like a dike or a dam or a new electricity grid which is resilient against tropical cyclones, investors are much more likely to step in and really fund this project if they know there's an insurer who takes parts of the risks. So insurance can also make investments possible. Also, to set up a new insurance cover, you need sound data, a risk analysis, a risk assessment stands at the beginning of every insurance product. So insurance can take care of risk transparency and in the end provides a price tag for risk and thus creates risk awareness amongst all stakeholders, not only amongst the clients and the insurance company. And it also can lead to risk prevention. For example, if you write down in your contract with your client, you need to do this and this and this to adapt to climate change, you can lower your premium, you will foster risk prevention measures. So in the end, what I would like to say is really that insurance is more than a pay-in, pay-out scheme. And as insurance companies, you can really promote this more, I think, when talking to NGOs or regulation authorities or with governments. Another important point is the so-called wheel of insurance. My boss, Thomas Loster, more or less invented this, and I like it a lot. So if you have an untapped market in a developing country, for example, and an insurance provider thinks, hey, this could be a good option, I would like to step into this market, he sees that there's almost no data available. You have maybe no statistics and so on, and you cannot calculate your premium and your risk. So in order to really tap this market, you have to fund research, and this is beneficial for science, universities, and so on. Only with this research, you will create some data. The data then is the fundament for every insurance cover, which then creates further growth in the market, which attracts further interest of other insurance companies, which then again foster new research. So once you get this wheel turning, you will really have some benefits for further parts of the society, not only for the insurance companies. For example, weather forecast systems for agricultural use and so on. So insurance is much more than just pay in, pay out. We heard also in this session that in order to reach specific scale of insurance, it's not enough to address only the single fisherman or the single kiosk owner or the single taxi driver. You need to address a bigger group, and this is only doable via public-private partnerships. If you have a look at the definitions which float around in the internet or in the Cambridge Dictionary, for example, you see that a public-private partnership is an arrangement where government and a profit-making company invest in and work on an activity together. Sounds very reasonable and is more or less the fundament for what we are talking here about when we talk about climate risk insurance. We as a foundation, we work very closely with the people at risk, and we say that a big or important stakeholder is missing in this definition. So you have the government who sees a risk for its you have the government who sees a risk for its population. They cannot solve this from a political point of view, so they address the business sector and ask them for a solution, which can be an insurance cover. But what is completely missing in most of the cases are the people at risk. And we as a foundation think only if you include them from the very beginning in every project, and this applies to the disaster risk management projects in the old-fashioned way, also to the insurance projects, you must include the people at risk on the very last mile. So we urge for a change of definition of the PPP, inform that a PPP includes a partnership between public sector, private sector, and the people at risk. Soenke has just said that the climate risk insurance ideas are quite new. So for the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years, we have seen a lot of ideas. Some projects are already in place. So we are at the beginning of a new era, let's put it this way. And we think that this is a good starting point to again think about the quite old-fashioned triangle of sustainability, because you really have to think of all these aspects when starting a PPP project in order to make it successful. Just to give you an example, if you're going to set up a micro-insurance scheme in the Caribbean, for example, and would like to hand out livelihood covers for fishermen, it's not enough to just talk between the insurance company and the government. You also have to talk to the people at risk, so to the fisherman or to the kiosk owner. So participation is an important part, because by that you do capacity building not only amongst the big stakeholders, but also amongst the people on the ground. You empower them, they really understand the product, and then they can promote the product amongst other fishermen, other kiosk owners, and so on. So it's also a question of handing over parts of the project, handing over ownership of parts of the project. So when putting together a team for a new project idea or for a new insurance cover, we think that it's important to put a team together which has the perspective of all these three edges of the triangle. So it's not enough to have just the hardcore businessman and the politicians on the one hand side, but you also might need an anthropologist or a geographer and so on. So it's rather about capacity building amongst all people involved in this project. Last slide. Oh, sorry. No. What is needed from the different stakeholders to really see a successful public-private partnership? This list is not very long and it's not exhaustive, so there are a lot more points which could be mentioned here. But I think one of the most important parts of the public sector is to really provide data. And this might be difficult when you think about personal rights, providing health data, for example, to a private business company. The public sector also has to provide an enabling rules and regulation, because without regulation for insurance, for example, you are just not allowed to step into a market. The agreements within the public-private partnership has to be understandable also for the people at risk, and this is the most important part, the public sector has to show political will, and the will must not stop after 4 years of your legislation period. And this is, I think, one of the biggest hurdles when talking about long-term public-private partnerships. The private sector has to provide data as well. They can provide a lot of capacity because the private sector has a long history in the developed world, which they can use or build trust on. They also have to bring in understanding to the table, and also breadth. And breadth here in the private sector is meant that the returns on investment might not come within the first 1, 2, or 3 years. And this might be a problem for some private business companies. The affected people themselves need to collaborate and understand the project, so capacity building again here is important, and they can also provide some local knowledge which the other two stakeholders might not have. So overall, important is that all three stakeholders do capacity building amongst themselves, that they stay in a sustained dialogue, which might take 1 year, 2 years before even starting implementing a project. And they all have to commit to a long-term commitment in order to make it really successful.
Thank you very much, Christian. I think that this is rather consensual, what you were presenting now. I mean, who would disagree that a public-private partnership in this area needs to include the people that are actually requiring the protection? So thank you for adding this dimension to the discussion. I think it's a great introduction also for you, Almazu, because you represent also, apart from being from the Ministry of Finance in Ethiopia, for those who haven't been here before, you also represent the V20. You're actually the presidency of the V20 this year. V20 is by now 48 countries representing 1 billion people, extremely vulnerable to climate change today and much more in the future. So I would be very interested, and we're very pleased to have you here to actually provide the perspective of the vulnerable people to this discussion. And maybe also you could answer after the presentation or in the presentation the question of, is this a tool you consider useful for protecting yourself against the risks that you see actually increasing over time in your country? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Armas Faisa. I'm from Ministry of Finance in the Economic Cooperation of Ethiopia. As the moderator has clearly introduced, my presentation is more or less on the V20 or the Vulnerable 20 or Climate Vulnerable Forum perspective in terms of in regard to insurance and the comprehensive climate risk management, addressing needs of the poor and the vulnerable. Just to introduce you, this is a Climate Vulnerable Forum and the V20 group of the Finance Minister, which is chaired by by Ethiopia currently. Mainly, its objective is to promoting ambitious effort to address climate change agendas, and which was established in 2019. And this forum has 48 member countries, and represented it's around or close to 1 billion people. And these people or these countries really extremely suffered than the adverse effect of the climate change than anyone else. So any discussion which later to the comprehensive climate risk management is really important for this country and for the people as well. So the main aim of this V20 is aiming to mobilize more resources, which is new and additional. I mean, to meet the objective of vulnerable countries, as I've already mentioned, that to build strong resilience using innovative fiscal approach and a financial tool, and the climate risk insurance is also one of the instruments that can be considered in the future. So actually, the V20 has 3 group focused discussion, and one of them is even really focused specifically discussing on the climate risk. I mean, we have shared the experience, and we are talking how we are managing the climate risk in a comprehensive way. So this is mainly which is related to the objective of the approach is strengthening the resilience to the climate change in a vulnerable country. Actually, we have witnessed that in several decades, there are repeated events of climate risk disasters which have adverse significant effect on economic, social, and environment condition of these vulnerable member countries. Actually, initially the approach is and disrupted the short recovery of the country money to achieve between these disasters. And we are expecting this climate change impact are accelerating in the coming decades due to the ongoing climate changes. Actually, the approach to address the climate risk is ineffective generally, because the response is mostly on post-disaster intervention rather than pre-disaster intervention. This is very expensive and expose the vulnerable household to huge loss of asset and livelihood, because of there is a general tendency to wait until the disaster occurred, then after looking for the emergency funding. This is a huge problem. So I think we need to shift paradigmly. A global paradigm shift is really required for better financing mechanism. And there need to be a coordination among all of the actors. Particularly at the magnitude of this loss is huge, better to have a coalition at higher level than each country is trying to address by its own. So kind of risk pooling will be really beneficial. The other effect is actually still the traditional approach is we are waiting until the risk happen, then after we are trying to address it. So unless there is increased investment in risk reduction and preparedness, the cost of this responding to crisis will continue to rise or increase, and force countries to frequently divert this long-term investment to address the short-term risks. So in general, it affects the overall development, and the risk will be the kind of vicious circus, and it cannot be sustainable. So the approach is really is not sustainable. So we need to shift from, instead of reactive crisis management, into investing in a prevention and early preparedness. That is what, as V20, we are taking. Just to share the experience of Ethiopia, now Ethiopia has developed the national policy on disaster risk management and a corresponding disaster risk management strategic program and investment framework. These are really sets for multi-hazard and decentralized approach to disaster risk reduction. And in addition to that, Ethiopia is now implementing like kind of, we call it the program, Rural Product Safety Net Program, which is Ethiopia's most progressive and pro-poor social protection program. And this is really helpful in addressing the climate risk ahead of a time. So in addition to that, I think since these people are vulnerable and which is eroded their base resources by different climate risk, there is need to use different instrument or comprehensive instrument. The climate risk insurance is also one of the instruments that can helpful to address when the magnitude is particularly huge. So as a country or as a V20 member country, we all recognize the importance of particularly this instrument, the climate risk instrument, but there is still some constraint that hinder this member country to implement it on the ground, which is some of it is financial related constraint, and some of it is related to the kind of technical constraint. As you have mentioned, there are different methodology to apply the climate risk insurance. So most of the member country not yet starting implementing this climate risk insurance because of this constraint. So in this area, I think the development partner and the different multilateral agency support is really important in addressing this constraint to implement the climate risk insurance. So I thank you so much for listening me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you also to the other panelists. I would actually like to see if there are questions from the audience first. Otherwise, I start the discussion. Is there anyone, any maybe also question of understanding? Totally fine. 2 microphones in the room. If you do not mind, just thank you.
Robert Gibson, Hong Kong University Science Technology. How does one go from zero, i.e. you don't have an insurance scheme, to having one that's viable? What's needed to sort of bootstrap it?
3 to 5 years. So I would answer that question, and maybe that was the really fast track answer from discussions we were having with the German ministry that started actually, I think, in 2012, discussing the African risk capacity, and I think it was 2015 that it was implemented, if I'm not mistaken. It took 3 years, and it was only because they had budget left and they needed to do it really spend it really quickly at the end of the year, and so they created a risk pool that then became the pool that the African risk capacity is financing its insurance payouts with. So this is actually, it was policy driven, it was government driven. Allianz, on our side, we're in discussion with the German Development Agency since 2 years. We have just submitted a proposal for co-financing a joint approach in 2 countries. The time that it will take until we see an insurance scheme in these countries will be 2 to 3 years. So we speak 5 years plus. Which makes me quite doubtful that we will manage to reach the 400 million target figure of the G20 unless we magically boost other schemes that are already in place. But maybe someone on the panel has another opinion, or more positive, I hope. Soenke, I don't know if you want to add something.
Well, I think it depends on the kind of product, and I mean, transferring the risk, if you know what you're talking about, etc., I think this can be done within this very easy. But something like, for example, what we're doing in the Caribbean, which involves to actually create this partnership where you have to get the governments on board, the regulatory authorities on board, the disaster risk management authorities on board, the innovative aggregators, because it's not like the insurance companies that can necessarily market such social products. It needs to be, for example, also tied to some kind of value chain. It needs to be tied to credit, stuff like this. This is a very complex process to go through. So for us, it took 3 years to make it to the market. And I think we were relatively fast with this 3 years. And then I think it takes at least another 3 years or so to actually mature the product enough and do the learning, etc., create the awareness and stuff like this. So I think something like 5 years, 6 years to actually establish something, concrete product, I think is a realistic timeline. And of course, it's a question of how you still have the kind of momentum with all the stakeholders in 5, 6 years' time. But what's your industry perspective on different products implemented somewhere else? I think it's also around that timeline, right?
Yeah, so I mean, we are reinsuring, and Munich Re much more than us. We're relatively small in comparison, but we are reinsuring already 125 million micro farmers in India and China. So there is already against extreme weather events and the impact on their harvest. So you can have scale. But this is then very conventional products, maybe with a more social component attached to it. What I took as a question was more the new kind of schemes that would pool risks among different governments, where you need to actually have almost a spirit of being able or being ready to pool the risks of an individual country with countries that are maybe have been your foe in the past, and now you share a similar financial risk. And I think this is one of the reasons, maybe you were too polite to say, but I think the V20, if they wanted, they could do a risk pool rather quickly. It's not necessarily a technical constraint, but it's you need to be willing to share a financial risk and liability with countries that you have maybe not always the most straightforward relations with, and that you are maybe not necessarily having an easy time explaining to your population why you are actually paying for something that then the neighbor gets a payout with. So I think these are tricky situations, and we see a lot of initiatives now from the German government, the UK, the US, the Netherlands, all under the Insure Resilience umbrella. There is now a fund that has been launched just 2 weeks ago in Berlin by the German government via their development bank, the KfW, which is a great fund. It actually allows to develop these schemes with 15 million euro, and with the hope that the industry will budge in the additional funding when they then, so that we co-develop such schemes. The limitation is, though, that the government, the host government, so the one that is benefiting from the insurance scheme in the end, will need to say, hey, we really want to do this. We are really wanting to apply for this funding. And it's not always easy to find the appropriate people to talk to in the government. So another reason why I'm happy to have you on the panel, it's not always easy to find the right people to talk to get such schemes actually developed. So play the ball back in a certain sense. But thanks for the question. It's a critical question. And when we were at this event 2 weeks ago, the whole topic was speed and how to speed up these things and how to keep the insurance sector at the table, because in our world, business turnaround is a lot faster. So I'm actually doing this on the moment on a cost basis. So it's clear that you need to be at the table for some time. It's a market development. We see a huge protection gap, but you need to remain engaged, and it's not always easy. Yeah. There was another question. Here, sorry, yes. Please. Can you stand up? There's a microphone just behind you. It's not coming to you, I'm afraid.
Okay, my name is Lydia Mahano from South Africa. And I just wanted to ask, first of all, to me, as I'm trying to understand, excuse my ignorance, but I'm trying to make connections between the presentation and the COP23 processes. And 3 words come to mind: vulnerability, because somebody said we cannot talk of insurance without actually putting the vulnerable at the forefront or at the start of the discussion; and capacity, because in my understanding, you must be able to afford insurance at some stage. And the other one, responsibility, because then, there's always, developing countries and developed countries, or who's responsible for more emissions and all that. So in view of this 3 concept, I wanted to ask, since to me, with the former presentation, I really loved to look at insurance as an enabling component. And I just wanted to since let me say, in the climate processes, we've been trying to bring the issue that, you know, even though the most vulnerable might not have the capacity to actually adapt, if I were to put it in that way. How do you, according to your perspective, I'm not quite sure, maybe if you could respond, then place climate insurance as an enabling mechanism or component of the COP negotiations? And then the other one, the question is, my understanding is that also equity forms part of the discussion, and normally equity is not yet defined. How do you define equity in the climate change negotiation, as most importantly also how it is reflected in the global stock take? And finally, how do we also define, or actually how does equity work if we were to put intergenerational equity into perspective when we look at the youth in the future? Thank you.
I'm so happy this is not an exam, because I think we would all fail miserably. But the questions are spot on. Thanks so much for putting this into the context and for bringing such important questions to the fore. In fact, I would invite everyone on the panel to answer. Christian, if you want to volunteer, please be my guest, and then I just go around the table.
I will volunteer and just answer the easy part. So how is insurance connected to the whole COP discussion? When we think about the COP discussions, it's about mitigation, adaptation, and maybe loss and damage. And in all three sectors, I think insurance can play a significant role. For example, mitigation, it's all about green energy. And you have already products in place which can ensure, for example, photovoltaic or wind turbines offshore and so on. So insurance here eases or makes it more likely that an investor invests into green energy, for example. So insurance is an enabler for mitigation. Second part, adaptation. Adaptation can be, for example, a more resilient electricity grid or a dike or dam. And again, it is been funded by donors or by investors, and they feel much more safer if parts of the new system, for example, have an insurance protection, or if the dike is being insured as well, so that you can, in the case of a loss and damage, get back some money. And loss and damage, I mean, it's clear if you have a loss, let's say the fisherman who loses his boat after a typhoon or whatever and has an insurance, then he gets back money and gets has a better, or it's easier for him to restart. So I think in all three aspects, in mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, you have a clear link to insurance. It's just maybe not so obvious sometimes.
So addressing the issue of responsibility and equity, perhaps from not quite the angle you were anticipating, but clearly, as you point out, the developed world has created a lot of this problem and should contribute more to solving the issue. One way in which the developed world has been helping is by producing the data that is needed to support the weather forecasting and weather modelling. And it comes down to a point that Christian made, actually. I think you had data in at least two of your headings. And we need, without the data, we can't say what's an extreme event or what's warm or what's cold and all the rest of it. So we need to keep the data coming. And in terms of meteorology and climate, what we've relied on hugely is data from satellites. For the last, since about the late 1970s, we've relied on data from satellites to just keep providing the data day in, day out for the weather forecasting, but also to give us the statistics on which we understand the climate. And the developed world has provided that for everybody, which is great. We've largely, well, the European Union has done some good work, and so has Japan, and so has India, but we've largely relied on the United States. And this is now, it's so worrying that the American administration is suggesting that it will withdraw support for its satellite programs. I mean, that's really worrying because we won't have the data, not just for the weather forecast, but actually, to keep monitoring for the statistics to tell us about extreme events. Perhaps they won't do what they say, but this is what they're saying.
That's a very, very important element, and it's true. I mean, without the data, you can't price risk, which means you can't calculate a premium, or you just guess the premium, and it usually will be more expensive, so higher than needed if you had a proper data record. And that's an important element. So let's hope the US keeps its satellites in space, or the EU is coming to rescue. Soenke, I think you might bring in some of the UN, expert speak here. I think loss and damage is probably looked at in a more political dimension that might be useful if you could shed light on that part.
I try my best. No, I think what should have become clear by now is that the whole theme is rooted in an international cooperation case. So everyone needs to bring something to the table, and we need to cooperate on this. It's data, it's political will on part of everyone, including the countries where we implement it. And it's also, I think, the industrialized world shouldering part of the responsibilities. It's always one of our talking points that there is this responsibility. And we not only need to see that from a climate justice perspective, but also just from a risk management perspective, because it's just not in a way, good risk management for the globe if these kind of disaster risks are increasing over time and there's no mechanisms to actually do something about it. It will fire back largely even on the industrialized countries themselves. So we always thought about it. We also had some papers floating around, even some publication thinking about how climate risk insurance can, for example, be funded through through carbon market-based mechanism and stuff like that, where you would actually even operationalize something like polluter pays, which would set also the right incentives in terms of financing these approaches. But in any case, I think it's an international cooperation case that we need to do. I think one important element is, and I'm representing Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. We are a combination of insurance actors, but also civil society actors. And the civil society actors are pushing us hard on thinking about, for example, a rights-based approach to adaptation programming, thinking about what does a rights-based approach means for climate risk insurance. And for once, it means that you prioritize the most vulnerable people. And that also, if you actually think it through, it means, for example, you cannot only promote private sector solutions. We had a big debate around, for example, premium subsidies in this regard. In the pyramids of needs, people that are hungry, they won't buy private insurance. It doesn't make sense. Yet they're a huge part of the protection gap and arguably also responsibility on parts of the developed world. So that's where we have to move in with social safety net approaches. Some of them might also be leveraged through additional public-private partnerships to increase the capacities. In the case of ARC is basically intertwined with the humanitarian system. The case of ARC is to have an objective mechanism by which you do a payout before a disaster strikes, and you have contingency plans. Yes, they need to be improved, but the idea is great. The money is there earlier on, and you even have a mechanism by which you can also take part of the responsibilities. So I think we have to think about, and not only, I presented two examples that are more on the social product front, but I think we also have to think about this kind of social safety net approaches. And if we spend the public money, for example, that is promised as part of Insure Resilience, we definitely need to spend a large part on these kind of approaches.
Thank you for putting this into the bigger context and also I think where we stand in the negotiations. It's definitely a touchy subject. I know that because I was last year at an UN event, and the whole discussion was around, okay, insurance is nice and good, but what if it's taken as a pretext so that we actually see less financial commitments from the developed to the developing world, and that should not be the case. Yeah. So maybe I think we should not overgo the voice of Admasu here, because you might have a very clear perspective here to share with us as well.
Okay, thank you. Just to react very briefly. I would also concur with Christian has said in terms of the connectivity between the insurance and with the COP23, with all dimensions, with the mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damages. The insurance part is really connected, particularly with the adaptation part, because as I've already said, that the climate risk insurance is one of the instruments. It's not the only one for adapting purpose. So we can utilize it, that one. In terms of methodology, in terms of capacity, those developing country has potential. So they should share with the developing country in terms of risk pooling, in terms of also the government insurance, and also micro-level insurance. So the instrument is really helpful for adapting or to increase the resilience of the people. So in that regard, there is really connection. About the equity, what I can say that, in fact, we are all in consensus that the developed world has more responsibility for the climate change effect. And the vulnerable or those developing countries are really or extremely suffered because of the climate change effect. Now we came to, we are going to reach on equity when we are reducing the number of people which is affected by the climate change, or when we are really increasing the number of people which is cope up with the climate change effect. Now we cannot stop the climate change at this point in time, but we can really increase the resilience of the people for the climate change. When comparing the developed world is really comparable, the resilience is really high. But on the other side, the developing world is really suffered. So because of historical responsibility or whatever, we say that the developed world should support the developing world to cope up or to increase the resilience at that time. And if most of the people is not affected by the climate change, that's, for me, the equity is reaching. So this is the point which I would like to add on what you have said so far.
Thank you very much. So we had all angles here. Are there any further questions from the audience? It's getting warm in here, I'm aware. Thank you. Thank you for keeping up the spirit.
Hi, I'm a grad student from Canada, and I was just wondering, with regards to public-private partnerships, how do you overcome the paradox between the government and the people who want to reduce their risk while insurance companies who actually profit from the risk? Please answer to the best of your ability. It's okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a totally fair question. I mean, just maybe as a background, and of course, you see, when we are asked what does climate change means for you, we say first, well, it costs us. It costs us dear money, because the insurance that we are actually, the policyholders, so the people that have bought insurance from us, they are more exposed to variable weather events, be it in the supply chain, be it the farmer that can no longer harvest and that has the payout from the insurance, be it business interruption because people cannot work due to extreme heat. It's all sorts of things that we insure. So the first thing is actually, yes, we like risk because we're good at it, we understand it, we think, but climate change means we understand less of it, and we'll understand it less and less, if you like. We are relying on researchers like Joe here to understand how the trends are changing, how the data is changing, so that we're actually able to calculate premiums that reflect the proper level of risk, and that's not an easy business. So we are definitely looking at this topic also from an opportunity, because we see that there is a huge gap in insurance, especially in the developing countries. I think last year we had 35 billion in damage that were not insured, or more. Maybe I'm getting the numbers wrong, but it's 2% of all damages globally were actually insured against climate-related disasters. So it's a super small percentage. And that means that 98% are basically not getting any compensation unless the government steps in. Now you can imagine that the government is more likely to step in when it has money than when it doesn't have money. And so insurance could be a mechanism where you enhance a payout that actually contributes to making preventing livelihoods from falling back into poverty. And I think in that sense, it's a positive development, but it is extremely difficult to make it happen. And we heard a lot of the obstacles today. So liking risk, yes, but knowing how to control it and being able to price it properly is challenging for this industry as well as it is for others. You want to add something, Christian, on that point? And the public-private partnership, maybe?
I'm not 100% sure if I understood your question correctly. So you just said that the insurers might have an interest in higher risk because then they can sell more products, right? Okay, but here I would like to echo our chair because, like she said, 98% of the risks is not covered, so we don't have to make up any risk. There's enough risk out there which still can be tapped without being very innovative. So I think it's not really a contradiction here because the risk is there and insurance can be one tool to adapt to the risk and to minimize the exposure of the client, for example. Yeah.
But we do have a problem, and that is that most of the governments that we're talking to want to have a payout every 4 years. Why? Because of the electoral cycle. So if they spend money on something, they want to make sure they actually see something back. It's like an investment, right? You want to see something back at the end of your electoral cycle so that you're getting re-elected because you have maybe diverted spending from education to ensuring yourself against the odds of climate change. And that makes it extremely expensive because in our world, you should actually only buy an insurance against extreme risks that maybe occur ideally only every 100 years. And that then makes sense because these 100-year events are very, very expensive. And you need to be able to provide shelter for the population, you need to be able to provide food, you need to be able to rebuild infrastructure, and all these things cost a lot of money. But if you have a 3 years event, that means you maybe have a street destroyed, maybe hit a school, that's relatively quickly built back. And so you should actually only insure against risks that are very, very expensive and that occur very, very rarely, but that's sometimes hard to sustain from a government financial cycle perspective. Gabi.
Hello, my name is Gabi Ram. I'm working for various development organizations in the area of integrated disaster risk management, and I'm a member of the advisory board of the MCII. I think we have a dilemma. When we are talking about climate risk insurance, we are talking about different levels of insurance. There is quite some demand as far as macro level insurance, like the African risk capacity insuring governments, and therefore also targeting the poor and the very vulnerable if they have certain conditions and contingency plans in place. But there's also on the micro level where small farmers or taxi drivers, whatever, can be insured. So one has to tackle this a little bit in a different way. But let's maybe stick to the macro level. I think what is very important, and that was already quite explained here also in the panel, saying that insurance is only one part of disaster risk management. And I think what very often is not really thoroughly happening is that, for instance, a government assesses and analyzes all the different disaster risk management mechanisms and really see how much does prevention cost when there is a drought, for instance. Yeah? What kind of disaster risk financing mechanisms can we avail of? Yeah? What kind of international, passing it to the international market, how much would this catastrophic loans cost, and so on, and then see what is the gap and can insurance really fill the gap. So at least from my experience, I have hardly seen that this really integrated disaster risk management mechanism analysis and have this cost-benefit analysis, that this is very often lacking or is only being done for a few mechanisms, but not within the entire cycle. And I think only then one can really see and convince also the governments or also enterprises, yeah, to see, okay, we can do this and this, and this prevention measures are much better for this kind of risk. and this part then can be covered by insurance?
I think I take this as a really valuable contribution, unless someone wants to respond. Maybe, Admazu, you feel like you want to respond to this? Maybe why governments don't do that? I can see some challenges from my perspective. It's not always easy to know what the cost is, unless you put it into a open market tender, for the insurance at least, and also for the CAT bond perspective. But Admazu, maybe you can explain if you think your government is doing it already, for instance, yeah? It would be interesting.
Okay, thank you. As a government of Ethiopia, I mean, the disaster risk management policy is already designed and endorsed by the parliament, and this policy is mainly focused or advocating the approach of addressing the climate risk through development. For instance, as most of you know, that Ethiopia has faced many times by drought, and this is one of the climate risk which is the government is recognized. So like investing in an irrigation project in different area, this is the approach that the government is really investing a lot by investing in irrigation projects and in small scale irrigation and also big scale irrigation. In such approach, we can cope up with the drought, for instance. But as I've already said, that this is not only enough, or it's not cover all area of the country, because it's required huge investment. So, but there are some microfinance who that are starting like small scale insurance activity, but it's not kind of exemplary, but it's not across the country. But there are some small scale insurance, microfinance institutions have provided this service for showcases. For instance, which I remember that UNDP is supporting the microfinance to implement this small scale scheme or insurance scheme for some area of the country, because we can use it that as a case study to expand it for other areas. But as a country, it's not yet started across the country. But as a government, we are approaching, addressing the climate risk through investing in development. This is the approach what the Ethiopian government is following.
Yes. Joe, please. And then I would take 2 more questions from the floor, but please go ahead.
I'm going to reveal my ignorance of insurance companies and things, but to what extent do you think countries might move some of their money towards early warning systems, and then they might not have so much to invest in insurance?
Yes. I can't speak from experience, but I know that there are several initiatives out there. One is Oasis, that is actually more or less a data platform that wants to promote the use of data also for early warning purposes. So there is, and there are several insurers that are a member of this initiative. So there are some initiatives that also are having a drive from the insurance industry that actually promote such form of actions. And I would see a clear-cut interest from my perspective, that is, if you have an early warning system in place, you have less damage as a result, and specifically you save lives, right? So it's not only damage to infrastructure, it's also making sure people are safe. And so if you look at it this way, it's actually becoming more insurable. Even if you have an extreme exposure to weather events, if you have an early warning system and clear procedures what to do when the early warning system triggers, that is allowing the insurance sector to provide an insurance cover at a lower price, and that's normally good from from our perspective, from the insurance perspective. But if you were asking me where is it actually already implemented, I would not be able to answer. So I think there are some countries that have started with this, and maybe Ethiopia is one. I don't know if you have had any contact with Oasis and the early warning approaches, but if anyone in the audience or Soenke, you have one, but I think this is definitely part of the overall approach that also Gabi was referring to, that you need to do a comprehensive risk assessment and integrate such approaches before you can actually, otherwise insurance is just expensive. You need to go through all the steps before you actually can write up a cover. Yeah.
I mean, quick reaction is definitely early warning systems are part of the solutions. I think even as part of the Insurance, cruise is also early warning kind of initiative brought forward in the context of the Paris Agreement. I think the French were the main force in that. And for our product that we developed in the Caribbean market, we actually had these debates because we have this kind of satellite data and whether these kind of information can also be used for early warning purposes, not only for verifying payouts and stuff like this. And this could be a way. You don't have to think as an either or, you can actually combine the two. And I think there are much more ways of doing it. And I also know that Munich Re Foundation did some work on early warning quite a bit actually. So we don't have to make that kind of say one or the other.
Christiana, if you want to add, I think the CCRIF also has an early warning system for its members, as far as I know. But that's the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Facility. Maybe Christian, if you have any.
Not really. I mean, like I said in the beginning, the two pillars within the foundation were quite separated as well, and it was only in the last 2-3 years that we more or less combined them. So the early warning systems we funded or organized were rather small scale. They were not of really interest to an insurance scheme because it was about protecting 5 or 6 villages in a river basin, for example. So it's again a question of scale. And many of the early warning systems I know are rather very small scale, and they just don't fit into the aims of a big insurance scheme, for example. So there needs to be some dialogue as well.
Yeah, ARC Risk View is
ARC
also
Risk
one, that's true. Sorry, I didn't get it, yeah. The ARC Risk View is indeed also an openly accessible way for governments to inform themselves about the risk exposure.
And maybe that's just to bring the whole picture together, and I think ARC is a good story. The German funding is only part of it. They started with ARC Risk View. That was the whole purpose, and it was starting from basically a model which does exactly this, early warning and showing when there's a famine coming, and then at some point realizing, okay, we actually might have an insurance case and that we can create a pool, etc., etc., etc. And that's actually also the way of how things should be done. For us in the Caribbean, I'm honest about this. We basically had this goal to get a product in the market within 3 years, which is very ambitious. So we couldn't actually do all of looking at, for a whole government, looking at the different risks, looking at the different instruments, walking all of them through. As a kind of learning, we then applied this later on. But I think it's one of the kind of ground rules or principles that is now more wisdom than it was before, that it has to be rooted into what's called comprehensive risk management. It's not only jargon, it's actually going through these different kind of steps and thinking exactly. And I think the insurance product comes at the very end or towards the end, not at the beginning.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions? I would take one more and then I would wrap up the panel discussion. If there are no more questions, maybe I can ask each panelist to give a short statement as to what are the key issues you think we need to tackle to achieve the aim of reducing the risk related to climate change, especially for the poor and vulnerable, and what role could climate risk insurance play? And the second part you do not need to answer, Joe, but if you have an opinion, please feel free to do so. Do you want to give it a start as the lady on the panel apart?
Just quickly to say, I think in order to understand extreme events, we need to continue the way that we're doing with a lot of data and a lot of more modelling, particularly focusing on regional impacts. So I think that the computer models have done really well in global picture, and now where the challenge is actually looking at more and more local effects and impacts of climate change. I'll stop there.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I think what I already said in my presentation, the biggest thing is that insurance is more than pay in, pay out. You have to promote that insurance can cover almost all aspects of disaster risk management cycle. And the other point I just forgot.
Okay, we come back.
We come back.
Okay, mine is because climate risk management is not an easy task. It's very difficult. It should be comprehensive. It's a long-term intervention, including, I mean, as I've already said, that we don't need to wait until the climate risk has already happened. Instead, we need to early warning and the preparedness should be started. And the insurance is also one of, I mean, the critical instrument that can be implemented, particularly in this developing and vulnerable country, to really adapt with the climate risk issues. Thank you.
I'm back in the game, sorry. I like the last sentence of Soenke, that the final product of the insurance comes at the very latest stage. So you first have to do a lot of learning, a lot of capacity building, a lot of talking amongst all stakeholders, and this will take time. And I think, Simone, you said this in the very beginning, take your time for 2, 3, maybe 4 years to just get into the starting phase and then start with the product. And this is a bit difficult, I think, as well for the business sector, but also for the government side. So take your time, be patient, otherwise it might not be too successful.
Okay. I think I started off by saying I see progress, at least viewing back the last 10 years, observing the debate around climate risk insurance. But these are only stepping stones. And I think there are concrete next stepping stones that we need to throw into the water. And one is we have all these initiatives and they need to move forward. They also need to be accountable. 400 million people is quite a big task, a big objective to meet. I think we need continuous support also by governments, also for reasons that have been elaborated before around supporting developing countries in their fight against climate change. We also need to work on the critical aspects. One is, for example, demand of countries in this kind of regional risk facilities. There are not many countries participating in the pools, and there are reasons for that, and they have to do with the political economy in the countries. They have to do, there are cost questions and stuff like this. So really working on these critical questions will be the next step, and I think this will be also a task of this global partnership that was addressed this afternoon. I think this is what needs to happen at the level of initiatives. If I think about countries, we also learned actually there needs to be a will in the country. There's a lot that the country needs to do. From our own perspective of trying out some of these approaches, the regulatory framework needs to be there, needs to be open to do these kind of changes, to be helped on some of the aspects. Generally, I think tying it also to social safety nets approaches in a systematic manner through, for example, contingency plans is something that the government needs to do, and, for example, also needs to open up their processes towards civil society scrutiny to make them truly work for the societies at risk. I also think that it's the DNA of the Paris Agreement to be ramped up over time, and this holds not only true for mitigation but also for adaptation. So I view the NDCs only as the starting point. And when I looked at the different NDCs and saw what's on climate risk insurance, I only see this is the first step. I was encouraged. I thought there would be less when I started it, and I thought, okay, well, we are not so bad. But I definitely see for the next iteration that countries have a more systematic approach to the issue. Generally, but also specifically on climate risk insurance. And then I think, lastly, in terms of the UNFCCC, so we have the debate around the risk transfer clearinghouse. And I think that should be the go-to place in terms of the debates. I observed myself that the loss and damage discussions are difficult, has been mentioned before, but nevertheless progress is possible. And it's also possible to do the progress outside of the UNFCCC and bring it back to the process. I think that's actually a theory of change, of the whole thing, of the whole conference that we are in. I see operationalization of the risk clearinghouse important, linking it to outside processes important, but we also need to establish international guidance. So far there's not enough. On the NDCs, nothing, nada, but specifically on climate risk insurance, also not much. I know that the Warsaw mechanism is taking up some of the actions, but there needs to be more, and I think this should be one of the concrete activities. And lastly, we haven't solved the support question. I think it's an important point to make. It will continue, but to actually have a truly global agreement where everyone buys in, this is an important part of the equation. And I think industrialized countries need to provide the support for these kind of approaches, need to provide support for loss and damage. And so this is going to be one of the questions to be solved, maybe concretely by taking it to the Green Climate Fund or others.
Wow, Soenke, you gave us so much to digest. So I'm just starting. I have 4 seconds left. But thank you, everyone, so much. In German, we have this saying, fitting a camel through a hole of a needle. If you understand what I'm meaning, it's a pretty impossible undertaking. Nevertheless, imagine that the fire is breaking out in the place where the camel is staying. And the camel just needs to fit through this needle hole to get out of the fireplace. So I think we need to work on it, and I think you might not see me next year here because I might be working on it. So I think it's really time to go for action, and so I hope that you are not totally discouraged from the discussion we were having. I think we saw there is the need for action. I think we saw that there are solutions around the corner. There is the demand as well for such solutions, and there is also the plea for governments from developed countries to make this possible and take their share of responsibility here. So it's a round thing, isn't it? Thank you very much for being here, and I wish you a very successful 2 weeks here. Thank you to the panel.